Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining from. This is Suze McCormick. I'm a partner at MoFo, where I had our groups focused on ESG and impact, but more importantly, I'm a board member of BSR, and a proud supporter of BSR for more than 20 years because as the sustainability space has become both crowded and I would argue lacking in substance at times, BSR has long been a leader in really working in with businesses and institutions. For now more than between 30 and 40 years by my last count. And so we're very proud to sponsor this series with BSR. This is our 15th in the series, where we are talking really to leaders in the sustainability and ESG world about how they are affecting transformative change. This morning, we are really, really honored to have another stellar guest, Eva Zabey, who is the CEO of Business for Nature. And she's going to focus today on how businesses can really scale to action for a nature positive future. And if you've been tracking this space over the last 20 years, I think nature for probably more than 2 decades has kind of gotten the short shrift. And I think now people meaning companies, investors, and governments are more focused. But one of the things I think Business for Nature is doing a very good job at is sort of parsing through the efforts to really determine what can affect change. They have the technical expertise really so that people can adopt, implement, enforce ambitious nature policies and help scale and speed up business action, which is just critical for our very survival as a planet and a species, and for the viability, financial viability and others of companies. Prior to starting and becoming CEO of Business for Nature, Eva was leading multiple projects at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development for over 15 years. And she also led the development of the Natural Capital Protocol on behalf of the Natural Capital Coalition, as well as the establishment of the new Social and Human Capital Coalition. So with that, I'm going to be quiet, mostly because I'm sick, but primarily because Aron and Eva have such valuable insights to share in this area. So over to Aron.
Thank you, Suze, and thanks for the kind words. As people who've joined this series before know, a huge fan of Suze and Morrison Foerster and the great work that they've done, really being a pioneer in terms of understanding the importance of sustainable business and bringing to bear all the great resources that MoFo has as a firm, and Suze has been leading on. I also want to throw some praise Eva's way. We have a lot of great people in our field of business and sustainability, and Eva's really one of the wonderful ones, a great leader who brings every ounce of energy, thought, and humanity to the work. So thank you for joining us, Eva. Really delighted to have you with us. Suze did a little bit of a description of some of your background, but maybe you can paint a little bit of a picture of your professional trajectory and how you came to be so engaged on nature, which, as Suze says, has not always been the leading topic in the sustainability world, although it's changed quite a lot in recent years. So how did you come to where you are today?
Thanks so much, Aron and Suze, and for this wonderful invitation and all the flattery. I think I'll just digest that. But
this is being recorded, so you can listen to it later.
I'll listen. I think I will record it and just listen to it every night before I go to bed, and also force my kids to listen to it as well. Yes. So actually, I think I've always had a passion for the planet, and probably starting more with wildlife. I was your kid with my Greenpeace backpack and my, only buying Body Shop. I became vegetarian at 13, which was shock horror, not your usual kind of kid. It was a long time ago, and people kept on trying to give me chicken, and I kept on saying, no, I'm vegetarian, I do not eat meat. But that was, so I think I've always had this passion of also not being okay with the status quo and thinking about how I can then change. So in whatever way. So I ended up studying ecology at Imperial College in London, and then doing a master's in environmental science. And it was during that time in the master's degree that, you know, I had a chance to work with a business and NGOs. And my professor at the time just said something that ended up shaping my career, because he was so dismissive of the role that business could play. So I was trying to focus on some of the positive things that I had seen in this company and how that could be scaled. And he just thought that, you know, business didn't have a role to play. And I thought that was incredibly irresponsible, actually, because you have all these amazing talents and students being conditioned to believe each, you know, one role, one thing. So then I realized, right, I've got to try and get into the business space and influence from within. So yes, and then as Suze was saying, then I ended up working at WBCSD, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, did a load of work on water, fresh water, really just even the simple tools at the beginning back in 2007 of, well, where's the water you use across your whole supply chain? Because even before you know how much water you use, you've got to understand where you use it. Because if it's in a water-stressed region, or if other parts of society need it for agriculture and for people's needs, you are at risk, basically. So long story short, then, you know, ended up going into nature and how do you value the capital, you know, this natural, social, human capital? How do you embed that in decision making? Because ultimately, we've got to integrate the value of environmental and social impact so that companies can be recognized and rewarded for these by the mainstream economic and financial system. And then, yeah, Business for Nature is, I'm just so thrilled to be able to lead this coalition, which is really focused on, yeah, scaling up business action and driving policy ambition.
That's great. It's a good reminder to every professor out there that you might inspire people to do what you think, and you might inspire people to do the opposite of what you think. So that's I guess they're both important. So let's talk about Business for Nature. What's the origin story, Business for Nature? What's its purpose in the world? How do you see it having impact?
Yeah. Well, so funnily enough, a bit like my professor, lots of different stakeholders in the conservation and nature space didn't necessarily think that business or finance had a role to play or should be around the table, and has always been seen as sort of part of the problem, which we need to be honest about is the case. And we need to shift from companies being part of the problem to being part of the solution. That shift is already happening. So you can't bucket businesses all in one bag, by the way. I do need to say that it's not a homogeneous group. But anyway, so the beginnings of Business for Nature really came because so those on the line might have heard and know of the climate convention, the UN climate convention that came up and adopted the Paris Agreement. And there's also another two conventions under the Rio Conventions of the United Nations. One is on biodiversity and the other is on actually desertification, which is even less known. But for now, let's focus on the biodiversity one. And it's called the Convention on Biological Diversity. And they have the same conference of the parties where all the governments come together. And there was one it must have been 2018, that took place in Egypt. It was the COP14, which means it was the 14th time the governments had come together. And there was hardly any businesses. There's never been that many businesses in these conversations. And it was really, you know, a very, you know, poor engagement, I would say. And after that, a number of organizations who work with businesses on sustainability said, right, and some of the influencers that we work with, like Paul Polman, Marco Lambertini and others, said, you know what, we've got to get together to rally a business coalition to engage in this process. And why was it such an important moment? Because the governments were negotiating a framework equivalent to the Paris Agreement for Climate, but for nature, called the Global Biodiversity Framework, or now the Biodiversity Plan. And that was supposed to be negotiated and agreed in China, in Kunming, in October 2020. Now, what do you think happened at the beginning of 2020? So we needed, so was COVID. So all of the plans got delayed, but that was the beginning of Business for Nature, learning from the We Mean Business Coalition on the climate side and saying there is such value in creating this momentum and demonstrating the business leadership as we influence these negotiations. So the beginning was about influencing the Global Biodiversity Framework at COP15, which ended up taking place in December 2022 in Montreal. And we managed to go from just a handful of companies at the COP14 to over 1,000 companies and financial institutions coming up, showing up, and sharing a call for ambition in the Global Biodiversity Framework, which is the roadmap now. There are 23 targets, and business and finance have, to be honest, a disproportionately important role in contributing to achieving those targets that are in the Global Biodiversity Framework. Since then, so that was adopted, we influenced a number of the targets, and I can share more if it interests you and others on the line. But we also realized there's no credible advocacy, there's no credible, influence of business without companies taking action. And nature is a relatively new topic for many companies. And so it wasn't quite clear how they could then start. There were a number of frameworks and guidelines, but in fact, we needed to, as a coalition, bring everyone together, bring these different frameworks and organizations together to agree on what are the steps and what are the key actions we want companies to take. And we did that. And it's called Assess, Commit, Transform, Disclose, or ACT-D. Something for everyone to remember in terms of when you think, well, what should we do and how can we start? What actions can we take to contribute to a nature positive economy? So assess your most material impacts and dependencies, commit to setting science-based targets for nature, transform, and that's the hardest one, because how do you avoid and reduce your negative impacts and then restore and regenerate? How do you transform your business models? How do you transform your regulatory environment in which you operate? And then D is for disclose on all of these things so that the increased transparency gives the information to the right people. But as you can see, I get quite carried away, Aron, so you're going to have to butt in if you want me to actually.
All right. Well, let me dive in with another question. I think that the trajectory you just described is really, really important. What do you think accounted for the massive, and it was massive, increase in business participation at COP15 as compared to COP14? Other than the COVID virus, what changed during that time?
Well, a number of things. So actually the COVID did trigger a few things, which means that first of all, there was what some people called an eco-awakening. Individuals reconnected with nature, and there was an increased appreciation of what nature provides.
Interesting, yeah.
The fact that the CEOs and the senior leadership of companies suddenly had a lot more time on their hands during COVID, because they weren't flying around the world and meetings all the time. They suddenly also had a moment of, this is a big moment in history. How am I going to show up? And what can my company do to contribute positively? I think we benefited hugely from the climate space and the fact that we could piggyback on all the learnings and the maturity of companies, the understanding that this is what happened for Paris and the agreement. Companies understand they need to manage their impacts and dependencies on nature came more smoothly as a follow-on. The fact that there was a global framework being negotiated and there were really clear entry points for companies to help influence that and be part of a much broader group, and it was being organized in a way. So there was a sense of being part of a much broader, mission for humanity somehow, without sounding melodramatic. I think also the climate link is important, but and more generally, issues like lack of water and soil health and air pollution, supply chain disruptions because of natural disasters, or just because raw materials or invasive species, or crops there was a sort of suite of events, which meant that companies were also recognizing, oh yeah, actually that is a potential risk that we are not aware of. And finally, I would say these different key frameworks that were being developed. On the one hand, the science-based targets for nature, the fact that companies need to develop targets and commitments that are aligned with planetary boundaries, so that that as a company, you're contributing to staying within the planet's resources. But then also the task force on nature-related financial disclosure that I'm sure we can talk about too. But the fact that was being developed and creating momentum in the investor community as well, and in the regulators, was a sign that then also created more engagement. So I think a bunch of all of these elements came together, and it was a very positive engagement. I think sometimes in other parts of sustainability, it's quite tricky, to see that things can and will get better, although they will. But on the nature agenda, the narrative is inherently positive, because in our lifetime, Aron, ecosystems can be restored and can regenerate. So there is this, if you let nature do its work. So that was also very positive.
Well, we'll get to the concept of being nature positive in a little bit, which builds on that. But what you described is a phrase that emanates from Silicon Valley, where I live, though not where I am right now, that Al Gore always likes to use, which is that change takes longer than you expect, and then it comes faster than you expect. And so, nature is one of those many overnight sensations, many, many years in the making, to borrow a Hollywood phrase, and so on. One of Business for Nature's main initiatives is Now for Nature. Tell us a little bit about what that's about, how companies can embrace that and be involved in it.
Yeah, really happy to. Thanks for bringing that up.
I figured you would be. Yeah.
Really proud of this one. So yes, this is it's Now for Nature. You can go to nowfornature.org. Is a joint global campaign that really aims to scale and speed up business action. So I was talking about Assess, Commit, Transform, Disclose, Act D. We also have sector-specific actions to go with it. But ultimately, how we're going to show and give that consistency to companies over the next years to 2030 of how they are taking action and how we demonstrating that as a collective. So with our partners, we worked hard to come up with this joint campaign that revolves around companies having a strategy. And the tagline...
Sorry, so we say with your partners, just give people a sense of who your partners are, so who you're working with.
Good point. Yeah. So we have over 90 partner organizations like BSR and World Economic Forum and International Chamber of Commerce, World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and others. 75% of these 90 plus partners are business associations, both at the global and the national level. And then we have some NGOs that have a track record of working with business, and they make sure that we keep the ambition really high. We're science-based, but then we also have a strong network of over 1,400 companies and financial institutions of different sizes and different sectors that are engaged with us on this journey. We work very closely with about 20 of them that sit on our business advisory group. So that's the way we're structured. Sorry, I should have said that before. So yeah, we always try to work collaboratively. Our intention is not that, we need to basically break down this competitive sense between, oh no, our report is better than your report, or our methodology and framework is better than yours. That's actually creating issues and slowing us down instead of speeding us up. So one of the roles as Business for Nature is to try and provide that. It's Now for Nature as an example. It's an unbranded campaign that everyone should be able to work with. And so yes, it centers around companies having a strategy. We went back to basics in a way, because without, we can have, and we're seeing all these pilot projects and different efforts in a very fragmented way. But if we're serious about companies contributing to a nature positive future, they need to have a plan, a forward-looking plan of how they're going to do that. And evidence shows that companies with a strategy for anything are way more likely to actually take action. And because action is what we want to have a positive impact, we're using the strategies. So we have a nature strategy handbook that's available on the website in multiple languages. And what we're asking for is that companies develop, publish, and then submit their strategy onto nowfornature.org. We will then review the strategy according to 4 minimum criteria that, if they are met, then the strategy will be included in the campaign, nowfornature.org. And the campaign will run to 2030, I should say. So what we want to see is this snowball effect. A couple of weeks ago, we launched the first 5 strategies. And what we want to see is an exponential increase of the number of strategies. I can't wait for people to need to use the filters that we have for per sector or size or company or geography. So yeah, so we have the Nature Strategy Handbook. What else did I want to say? We have the first 5. And then, yes, what was important just to say to this audience, if you do have a strategy, to submit it that's already available, please submit it by the 30th of August if you want to be part of our COP16 announcement. So COP16 is the next conference of the parties that's going to take place in Colombia, but I'm sure we'll talk about that later. So yes, and maybe you would be interested to know what that was what I was going to say, the 4 minimum criteria to be part of the campaign.
Yes.
Yeah, so just so everyone knows, first, you need to have carried out a materiality assessment. Second is you need to have defined targets that are smart and aligned with those impacts and dependencies. Third is then you need to show the actions you're going to take. And fourth is there needs to be some governance in place. The strategy needs to be C-suite or board approved so that there is responsibility for its delivery. But we're not going to judge how ambitious the strategy is. We're just going to make sure that those basic pieces are part of the strategy so that others can learn and be inspired by them.
Terrific. So it's a little bit different than the SBTI, for example, which will go in and verify. So quite a bit different in that regard. Great.
And probably for that, then it would be SBTN is the equivalent. Sorry to jump in. So yeah, so then we have the science-based targets for nature, whose methodologies for freshwater and land are available. And then there's a validation process that is being put in place now for those specific targets. So the strategy is, and it's Now for Nature, is a much more, I would say, accessible but broader, it might, you tell me if it's harder to develop a whole corporate strategy or to include nature in your strategy, or to develop science-based targets. I think you need some targets that are based on science in order to develop a credible strategy.
Well, I think that's right. One without the other. What's the old saying? Without one hand on the clock, what good is the clock if there's only one hand? You need.
Oh yeah.
Sorry, there's a much more elegant way of saying that I can't remember. But yes, you need the targets, but if it's not backed up by a true organizational commitment, and let's face it, in the world of climate right now, we're sort of going through some bumps with respect to that, where commitments are made without the backing of a strategy that's truly embraced by the entirety of the company. And then all of a sudden we see, oh, things aren't happening the way we said they would, or we thought they would, or we think they should. So I think that's quite smart. Now, to shift a little bit and I should have said at the beginning, I'm going to ask Eva some questions. As you've already seen, we want to also leave it open for people to ask questions. So the Q&A function should be available in your Zoom. So pop any questions you have in there. I'll try to integrate them into the into the discussion as we go. Let's talk a little bit about the concept of nature positive, which has gotten a good bit of traction, and that is a little bit more of talking about what the outcomes are. And so say, what does that mean? And how do you know it's real if a company says that it's aspiring to be nature positive?
Great question. One of my pet topics. So, so please do cut me off if I go on for too long. Nature positive. Nature positive, first to define it, it's a societal global goal. It's a goal for society to halt and reverse nature loss by 2030, which means that by 2030, we want to have stopped the loss and already started to come back. So we have more nature in 2030 than 2020 as a baseline. And you can measure that and look at it by looking at species and ecosystems and ecosystem function, our populations, you know, abundance of population, health and resilience of systems, etc. And there are ways that you can measure that to know if we're better off or worse off in 2030 than we were in 2020. Now, there's a big question because it's a bit like the 1.5 degrees equivalent. It's like the overall goal that we should all be contributing towards. In nature, because there are so many different elements, when you look at fresh water and land use and oceans and biodiversity and air quality, it means that it's not as straightforward to be able to say, right, this is your attribution, this is your proportion that you're responsible for. And so what we say at Business for Nature, and we've agreed with a number of our key partners, that companies and financial institutions should focus on contributing to that societal goal at the level, the impact of and influence that is relevant to the size of their organization. But they should not right now claim or set goals to be nature positive themselves. And I'll explain. It's because this is about a transformation of the whole way, in a way, our systems work. And it's not possible for one individual, even a human or an organization or a country, to truly be nature positive unless we all are. Because think of, you know, environmentally harmful subsidies. Well, you may be doing whatever you can to be nature positive, but then you rely on a whole system that is dragging you back to not be. And so instead of having endless conversations about whether you can or cannot say or claim, we prefer to say, you know what, focus on the actions, because we know that there are no regret actions that you can be taking right now. Focus on the very powerful nature positive concept, which is very ambitious and gives you that inspirational, vision of where you should be aiming for, and then get on with it. And in between times, the Science-Based Targets for Nature Network and other groups, the Nature Positive Initiative, will be working on metrics that then can be applied, but they're not ready right now. And so let's be a bit risk averse. This isn't the time to be, overstating or making disproportionate claims. Got to be careful about what you then state. But I think someone asked me just today, is there a risk of greenwashing? Well, certainly there is, but there's also a risk of diluting what is a really powerful tool, a powerful term, if we misuse it now. So I would say, please do, all focus on this, rallying behind this overall goal of nature positive, and focus on the actions you can take to contribute to it.
What advice would you have? So that's very well said, and I think you speak to the systems nature of this, no pun intended, which is almost a cliche in the world of sustainability, but cliches have rest on a foundation of truth, and it's certainly true here. For a company that's looking at its operations and its value chain, saying, you talked about water stressed regions in some places. I live in California. I'm in Denmark right now. California has a lot of water stress. Denmark, not so much. It's not Denmark's problem. So for a company, how do you get started, and how do you break this down into pieces where, yes, the systems matter, but the systems are reflective of concerted action by companies and others? So what's your advice for a company that's looking to make a start? You talked about materiality earlier. what role does that play? What other steps are important?
Yeah, I actually think that lots of companies are doing far more and know much more already inherently about the potential risks related to nature than they think they do, but they might not call them nature risks or nature-related risks. The way the science-based targets for nature have broken down what nature means, and they've put it into buckets of freshwater, land, oceans, and biodiversity. Biodiversity underpins it all. Biodiversity is the variability of ecosystems, of species. It's the more diverse an ecosystem is, the more resilient it is to shocks. But for now, if you think instead, biodiversity might be hard for some organizations and some companies to relate to because the impact and the dependency will be indirect. So if you focus on the things you know about climate and your emissions, you know about freshwater, surely, and your land use and impacts. Oceans may not be as relevant depending on, which industry you're in. And so then you say, so first of all, this sort of, okay, don't get too worried about the complexity of all of these different things I need to look at, but rather break it down and then say, okay, so what of these elements does my company fundamentally impact on? Are those impacts negative, or maybe they're positive? And which of those impacts which of those parts of nature do we fundamentally depend on? And once you understand those impacts and dependencies, you can extract from that the risks and opportunities for your business. I would say to in a way leapfrog over some of the complexity, I would recommend you do have a look at some of the sector-specific overviews that we've developed with the World Economic Forum, WBCSD, Business for Nature, and many others, that break down, okay, in your sector, what are typically the top 5 impacts, top 5 dependencies in your sector, and the top priority actions that you should be taking to contribute to a nature-positive economy. You can't go far wrong, at least you can start. So I would also recommend that companies do see where in their corporate strategy more broadly and their more mainstream business operations, they can fit nature in. So think of your procurement strategy or your reporting strategy, your compliance, your talent retention and HR. Think about all of these different elements and your supply chain resilience, and just think about how actually what would happen if you lost key pieces of nature, which is what's happening right now. And then what you would have to benefit if you could contribute to restoring and regenerating.
That's excellent. What sector, for the sector guides, what sectors are available right now?
Well, there are 12. So we've got agri, and I won't list them all, but there's chemicals, forests, cement, pharmaceuticals is on the way. Yes, so I'll put the link in the chat perhaps, and they're all available on our website.
Terrific, terrific. You mentioned the TNFD, so say a little bit more about how that can reinforce both the strategic dimension of things and also coming up with an actual plan, because that's how the TNFD, just like the TCFD, is designed to operate.
Yes, so the TNFD is essentially a risk and disclosure framework. It provides guidance, just like TCFD does, for what to include in your disclosures. That includes developing scenarios, but also having a strategy. And what's important with the TNFD is that as it gets in a way endorsed and embedded, like we've seen in Japan, different countries leaning in to say, yes, we're going to make it mandatory for companies to disclose on their nature-related risks that have of course, a financial element, but also a material impact for the for nature as well, and for people. TNFD is a really helpful framework to also respond to the increasing reporting requirements that are being asked. So there's a tool there that's ready. And interestingly, what we're seeing and hearing from companies is that while, yes, certainly in the EU, with all, you know, and we can talk briefly about that if it's helpful, but there's the corporate sustainability reporting directive, there's the sustainability due diligence directive, there are many different regulations that are coming into play that will affect companies in the EU and outside of the EU. Interestingly, the first reaction may be, whoa, I'm overwhelmed. But the second reaction is, well, because it is coming and it is a regulation, it means that these topics are now being discussed at the C-suite when they weren't before, even if the risks themselves are just as material as they were with or without the regulation. So what is great with the TNFD is that we have the resources to support companies and guide them in this process.
So it's a really good point, and actually we're 38 minutes in. I'm amazed that we only mentioned the CSRD now. After 38 minutes, it typically comes up a lot faster in these kinds of discussions these days, and the CSDDD and so on. And I think, and I'm going to maybe make an editorial point here, I think the rise of these regulations is crucially important. As you say, it is elevating the level inside companies at which these discussions are taking place. I would caution that it can sometimes inject a great deal of caution, a risk orientation, and a compliance mindset, which is not the point. The point is to handle these matters in a strategic way. Yes, of course, the regulations matter, but what they signal is the importance of this, the heightened importance of this, and the strategic importance of this. And this is true on climate and on other topics. A little bit of a side point, then I'll come back to a couple questions. It occurs to me, and maybe this is a US, American's mindset, but that nature is not the culture war flashpoint that climate is. Do you agree with that? If so, do you think that will continue? Is biodiversity something that, you know, everyone likes birds, everyone likes animals? Maybe it won't be seen in quite the same way, but what's your take on that whole point?
Well, I think that's a really, really good point in terms of, I do agree with you that nature hasn't become maybe as politicized, and there are some countries, you know, I think Australia is one where it's the political landscape on climate and nature is very different. So very progressive on nature. And there's a new Australian nature repair market bill, and there's a whole lot of regulation going on there. That's just to illustrate your point somewhere else in the world. Unfortunately, I think we might have a little bit of a honeymoon period now on nature and regulation, and I think we're starting to feel the pushback, especially when there's a realization of, yeah, it's not just these typical species that you think about, but also soil health and, you know, the quality of water and waste management and all of these different things that suddenly hit home harder. Yeah. But I do think that there's maybe certainly in the UN, in the United Nations system, I think there's always been a much stronger sense of collaboration, and even but we do experience the pushback. And I think just on the EU, staying in the EU with the nature restoration law, there's been a lot of pushback on the EU nature restoration law, which we're not sure is going to go through because of strong lobby against it from different industry groups. And I feel, and yet many companies have stood up and said, we need this restoration law, also because it's exactly what's necessary to achieve the global biodiversity framework that 196 governments adopted just, you know, a year ago. And so if the EU can't do it, there's a sort of question of, well, who can then, you know. So I think there's a bit of the pushback, but there will be, but there's a cycle. It's a bit like you manage to create the ambition, and the policy ambition is necessary, and in a way, because it's becoming a material issue, that triggers a reaction, which is to push back. And so I actually see the pushback as a very positive signal that nature is definitely a material issue for business and policymakers. And I would just say for companies, they should be, interestingly about CSRD and others, is that the companies that have been on this journey and have been anticipating the requirements wherever they are in the world are feeling equipped to respond faster than all of these other companies that are going to be hit with it. And often you realize that some of the pushback is, of course, from those who did not take it seriously enough and realize that they have a lot of catching up to do. For those who have been investing in these and understanding their material impacts and dependencies, yes, it's a lift. I'm not pretending it's not, but they are already have that buy-in and will be ready to comply with these regulations.
Thanks for that. And, you know, as we were talking, I was thinking to myself, well, I might have been a little bit overly optimistic. In fact, water wars is something that we've faced in many parts of the world for quite some time, and it's only getting more intense and so on. All right, let's shift a little bit. In the climate world, there's a lot of discussion about just transition. We know that people rely on nature. Nature sustains people. Nature also sustains people's livelihoods. And some of the transitions we need to make may bring change and may dislocate people in communities who are reliant on certain ways of doing things that may no longer be so literally so sustainable. So how do you think about the intersection of social impact, economic impact, and equity when it comes to nature?
Well, thanks for raising it, because I actually think on the nature side, it's a very direct connection. And so there is no nature positive without people positive. And in all of the biodiversity and conservation discussions, I think people, women, indigenous peoples, local communities have been so central and as the stewards of biodiversity and the nature we have. So I think it's maybe that there needs to be more that is done to recognize it. And actually at COP15 in 2022 at the Biodiversity Conference, it was the first time that the indigenous peoples and local communities were finally recognized in such a strong way in the final agreement. So I do think that you make a really important point about how we don't leave people behind in the transition. And one of the things that we've been talking quite a lot about and has been a focus of some of our work has been on environmentally harmful subsidies, because that does create nervousness within communities that rely on these subsidies. And of course, when you think about it, the subsidy in itself is not inherently going to, designed to be bad for the environment. It's designed with a socioeconomic purpose in mind, which then responded to a need. The environmental harm is an unintended consequence, but if we need to now shift away from it and move to more nature positive outcomes, so if you think about well, obviously fossil fuels, but agricultural, chemical pesticides, how we're going to move to more regenerative incentives. Same with the water, the forest, and the mining sectors, and all of these different parts of the economy that rely on subsidy. When you say subsidy reform, there's a bit of a knee-jerk reaction for the people who depend on those subsidies, and therefore we need to manage that transition really well. But I do think that, yeah, on the nature side, I think they're definitely not perfect, but there has been many more of the seeds planted a long time ago that now finally can grow and we can build on. And then groups like TNFD and others, SBTN, have been working on, but on sort of engagement. How do you engage with key communities as you then take action?
And I suppose the other dimension here, which stands, in my view anyway, in sharp contrast to the world of climate and social and economic impacts, is nature, and you alluded to this before, is hyperlocal. You know, a ton of carbon is a ton of carbon is a ton of carbon, but a liter of water has very different significance in different places. An acre of land has very different significance in different places. People's ability to, you know, fish, you know, very different in different locations. So getting after the problem may, you know, one of the unintended consequences is that people in communities are very substantially affected by the need for change. So squaring the circle here strikes me as being quite a bit more complicated than it might be on the climate side.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't really have much to add because you've exactly pinpointed that. It's at a local level, and then sharing learnings so that we can scale it up, you know, across the world. And that's where I think maybe I did say I wasn't going to add more, but I think the way of how do you value nature in decisions, and the value depends on who is doing the valuing. So
Correct.
that's where the local communities is so central, because you may think, well, this is not such big value to my business. But then when you look at the value to the people and the communities, then you can embed that in your decision making.
Yeah.
And that can be very helpful.
Yeah, and there, of course, has been quite a lot of work done on that, and it's the flip side of the social cost of carbon, which is the cost. There's the social value of nature, but then you have to translate that into something that adjusts the economics so that decisions are taken elsewhere, which again points back to the need for systemic solutions, because it's hard for a company to shoulder that on its own. It needs to have, you know, a more rational way and a more universal way of injecting pricing considerations into various decisions.
Absolutely. And it needs to be level, like you need to have a level playing field. It's as if, you know, it's as if we're coming with new cards of a game, the new cards being, you know, local communities, indigenous peoples, the value of nature, societal, you know, all of these different elements. And we're saying the game's got to change, the rules of the game's change. And if we continue, I really do feel, and Aron, you know, you also, like me, have been in this space for a while. It feels that there is a shift in the conversation that we've never had before in sustainability. And we're a bit overwhelmed because there's a lot more interest and engagement. But this is maybe the moment we have actually been waiting for. Because if we are then getting too many requests, too much interest, we're starting to push the system that we had in place to its limit, then it will accommodate these new pieces. We have to persevere, and these new cards will then be part of the main game that everyone's playing.
Yeah, it's absolutely right, and I think the questions are getting more complex. The answers, the seriousness with which all actors, companies, and others need to create the answers require more thought, more investment, more strategic thinking, but that's the right place to be. Otherwise, we would be tinkering at the edges. We've got about 10 minutes left. I do want to invite people to put questions in if they have them. Let me ask you a little bit about COP16. What would you like to see come out of COP16 this October? And how do you think companies can get involved? And how should companies get involved to lead to a positive outcome?
Great. So thank you so much, Aron, for that question. COP16 is comes after COP15, surprisingly. It's the next time all the governments are going to come together after the big agreement of the Global Biodiversity Framework. So they're coming together in October and November this year in Cali in Colombia. This is really framed, the Colombian presidency is framing this conference as the implementation COP, and it's the COP of the people. It's going to be, and the overall theme is peace with nature, that we need to find that balance between economic and environment. So we find that balance, and that we make peace with nature. So it's an implementation COP, which means by COP16 in October, we need to have demonstrated that we're out of the starting blocks and progress is already being made to start to achieve the Global Biodiversity Framework. The governments need to have developed what are called the National Biodiversity Strategies and Action Plans. For the moment, 8 governments have developed and published them. We still have a way to go. We know that lots of governments are working on them. What we're doing is that we're making sure that businesses and the financial institutions continue to engage in this process. It's really important that business and finance contribute to the global biodiversity framework, but also show that they are present and there to support other stakeholders. So that's where there are basically three things that companies can do now to engage in COP16. Number one, which is maybe the most obvious, is to participate. So we have a special webpage where we've got the latest information that we have. We've got a sign up form for expression of interest if you want to join in person or virtually. There's a whole registration process in the CBD, and we are working with partners to help with BSR also to help streamline that. So be there, speak up, show up, and engage in the process. The second is on the policy side, which is that we currently have a business statement that calls for continued and renewed ambition on policy for nature that will then be released 100 days before COP16 to make sure that we are sending a continued message specifically in this very intense political environment with polarized views and all the elections and the pushback on ESG and things like that. It's important that businesses step up and say, you know what, we still need this ambitious policy in place. And the third way is company can engage is, of course, by submitting their strategies to It's Now for Nature. Because just like governments are coming with their national biodiversity strategies, we'll be coming with, well, look, business and finance have their strategies too. And it will be an opportunity to stock take and say, how is everything adding up? What else needs to happen? The worst that could happen is that at COP16, we have no progress. It's unlikely we'll be way out the gates, but we have no time to lose. So we need to demonstrate that progress is being made and that more connections. It's the only place where you'll have all parts of society in one place in person. And we know that that's where so many solutions come up.
That's terrific. I assume that companies can learn more through Business for Nature. The BSR Nature team is also available to give people insight. BSR will be represented at COP16 as well, so we will show up. So COP16 is in Colombia. COP30 for climate is in Brazil, and that's a significant COP for climate, and significant climate COP. And because it's taking place in the Amazon, technically, it's in Belém, it's intended to put a fine point on the need for nature preservation as part of the climate solution. So how do you see those two things fitting together?
Well, they fit together really well. There is, of all countries, I mean, Latin American countries are so biodiversity rich, so nature rich, and they really recognize that value. They have the societal and development issues to deal with, and they're impacted by climate. So they really have such an interesting region to focus on. So that connection is very strong. We're seeing in the climate discussion so much more recognition for the role of nature, and that is absolutely central because, you know, when you think about it, it's completely artificial to separate climate and nature. If someone was watching us, as you know, have these conversations, they say it makes no sense. It's just one planet. But there are these processes that are in place that have sort of artificially separated climate and then the rest of nature. And the reason that they're so joined up, that they're two sides of the same coin, is that 30% of all of the solutions to tackle the climate mitigation come from nature. And also don't forget that over the past 10 years, over 50% of all of the human-induced emissions have been absorbed by nature. So if we continue to lose nature, we're just making it even harder for us to solve the climate crisis. And then similarly, if you want to reverse nature loss, you need a stable climate. Climate change is one of the top 5 drivers of nature loss. So there's that connection, which I think is going to be really fascinating to see in a region with that continued red thread through COP16 to COP30. And it will force us as humanity to really tackle interconnected challenges that we have, that maybe AI can help us as well.
Well, Eva, that's great, and that's a perfect and inspirational note to end on. So I really want to thank you for an engaging discussion and for all the leadership that you're exhibiting and that Business for Nature is contributing. Nature is everyone's business, as it says on the background. So thank you so much. And with that, let me pass it back to Suze.
Thank
Yes,
you.
Eva, thank you. And Aron, I always get a lot out of these discussions. I've been focusing on climate since 2001. Obviously, nature is a big part of it, but really focusing on that intersection and the business need for preservation, I think is critical. So thank you. If you have listened in, we have our next episode where we are navigating evolving climate disclosure, the SEC being on one side, but with California and the EU and China and around the world, with one of the luminaries in the field. So that will be June 25th. And we look forward to seeing you there. I'm going to pass it back to Aron before I start sneezing again.
All right, Gesundheit, Suze, and thanks everybody for joining us. And we look forward to being with you on the next episode. Bye-bye.